When my granddaughter accused me of something I didn't do, I didn't defend myself. She whispered cruel lies to the family, planted doubts in the ears of those who once saw me as their rock. She said I was dangerous, that I made things up, that I was trapped in the past. I stayed silent, but while she gathered rumors, I gathered facts. And then, at one long table, I told everything. First, she went quiet. Then, everyone else did. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Jeanette Webster. I was 78 years old, and I had spent most of my life as a school librarian in a small Pennsylvania town. For nearly 4 decades, I had guided young minds through stacks of books, helped students discover the quiet power of stories, and lived by the rules of order, logic, and respect. After my husband passed away, I stayed in the house we built together, surrounded by the comfort of shelves lined with fiction and photographs of a family I thought I understood. I never demanded much from anyone. I believed in giving space, in not imposing. I never played the martyr or the meddling matriarch. I kept my appointments, made my meals from scratch, remembered every birthday, and sent cards that I chose with care. I was the kind of person who used cloth napkins even when eating alone. I liked to think that mattered. My granddaughter Claire had always been special to me. As a little girl, she was curious and bright, with a sharp mind and a laugh that filled every corner of a room. We spent hours reading together. I introduced her to Louisa May Alcott and E.B. White, and she insisted on reading The Secret Garden twice. She used to crawl into the big chair in my study, pull a quilt over her knees, and say, "Tell me a story, Nana." Those memories were stitched into the fabric of my being. But as she got older, the calls came less often. The visits grew shorter, and the energy between us began to shift in ways I couldn't name at first. Claire went off to college and came back different, more polished, more guarded. She used to call me after her classes to tell me about professors she admired or boys she liked. Then, without warning, that stopped. I assumed it was just growing up. Life gets busy, priorities change. I tried not to take it personally. Still, something gnawed at me. At first, it was subtle. A missed holiday. A forgotten thank you note. Then came the stories, the ones I heard through others. Comments passed down secondhand, that I was forgetful, that I said strange things sometimes, that I might be slipping. I brushed it off. Aging brings assumptions, and I had always taken pride in my composure, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, sharper, more specific, and most alarming of all, they were all traced back to Claire. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. Then came the family dinner that shifted everything. My nephew leaned across the table and asked, in front of everyone, "Is it true you yelled at Claire about some missing jewelry?" I stared at him, baffled. I had never said such a thing. I didn't even own jewelry valuable enough to be worth stealing, let alone worth shouting over. My voice caught in my throat, and I answered quietly, "No, of course not." But the damage had already been done. His eyes didn't hold malice. They held pity. That pity shattered something in me. In the days that followed, I noticed other changes. My daughter-in-law began speaking to me slowly, using a tone usually reserved for small children. My son checked in more frequently, but spoke in vague, guarded terms, like someone worried he might say the wrong thing. No one asked for my side of the story. No one wondered if Claire might be mistaken or misleading. I felt myself slowly being pushed to the perimeter, redefined not by my actions or my history, but by a single narrative that was not my own. I had become a character in someone else's story. It was as if Claire had taken a red pen to the script of my life and begun editing it line by line until the woman they knew bore no resemblance to the woman I had been. And the worst part? She did it with a smile, not openly, not with confrontation, but with carefully placed suggestions, with fragments of fiction stitched into conversations. She rewrote me into someone fragile, volatile, untrustworthy, and no one questioned her authorship. I spent long afternoons in the quiet of my house, the ticking clock louder than usual, the silence stretching longer than it used to. I went through old letters, photos, journals, looking for comfort, for reassurance. I replayed memories like tapes, testing them for cracks. But they were real. My mind was still mine. I hadn't forgotten. I hadn't imagined it. And that's when I realized if I responded with anger, I'd only confirm their suspicions. If I argued, I'd be defensive. If I cried, I'd be fragile. So I did what I had always done best. I listened, I watched, and I waited. Because I knew something Claire didn't. I knew the power of silence, the strength of observation, the truth hidden between the lines. I had spent a lifetime reading people, tracking the subtle rhythm of language, hearing what wasn't said out loud. If she wanted to tell a story about me, I would let her write it, but I would keep the receipts. Because one day I knew I would tell my own story, and this time they would listen. I began to notice it everywhere. Little signs that the narrative Claire had crafted about me was taking root. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like ivy creeping along the side of a house, unnoticed until it covers the bricks. I saw it in the way people tilted their heads when they spoke to me, the careful pauses before they answered my questions, the way my words seemed to be weighed and measured for signs of weakness. I had spent most of my life being the dependable one. I was the person who remembered birthdays, who organized family photos into albums by year and event. I was the one people came to for advice, for recipes, for guidance. I had always assumed that the years I had poured into my family, the meals cooked, the letters written, the long drives to soccer games and piano recitals, had earned me a certain place in their hearts, a place rooted in respect. But Claire had chipped away at that place. I didn't know when it began. Maybe during one of her college breaks when she stayed for a night and spent the entire visit on her phone, barely speaking to me. Maybe it was later, after graduation, when she started working and became more concerned with networking than visiting. Or maybe it had been growing for years, right under my nose, behind her sweet smiles and empty compliments. I started to test the waters in small ways. I would mention something we had done together, like the time we spent an entire afternoon baking cookies for her class party in the 6th grade. I thought it might open a window back into the warmth we once shared. Instead, she laughed and said she barely remembered it. I noticed the others around the table glanced at one another, as if to say, "Here she goes again, confusing things." I wasn't confusing anything. I remembered everything. The first time I heard someone repeat one of Claire's lies to me directly, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. It was at a barbecue hosted by my nephew, a casual event, burgers and lemonade, kids running barefoot in the grass. My cousin's wife leaned over to me and said, "I hope you're feeling better these days. Claire told us you were having a hard time distinguishing dreams from reality." I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. Dreams from reality. It was such a specific phrase, carefully chosen, meant to sound sympathetic, but soaked in condescension. Claire had always been good with words. She knew how to weaponize them without ever raising her voice. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly a single seed of doubt can grow. I realized Claire hadn't just lied about one thing. She had constructed a version of me that was unstable, unpredictable, confused. And it wasn't just for strangers. It was for my family, my son, my daughter-in-law, my other grandchildren. She was stealing something from me far more painful than money or possessions. She was stealing credibility, stealing my history. I watched the shift in my son most closely. Thomas had always been practical, not prone to drama. But over the months, I saw him grow cautious with me. He called more often, but the conversations felt rehearsed. He asked if I was taking my medication regularly, even though I had never been prescribed any. He offered to help me organize my finances, a task I had managed flawlessly for decades. He meant well. That was what hurt most. He wasn't cruel. He just believed her. She didn't scream her accusations. She whispered them. I pictured her in corners of rooms, leaning in during casual conversations, frowning slightly, saying, "I'm just worried about Nana." And people would nod, because what kind of monster doubts a granddaughter who's simply worried? What they didn't see was the gleam in her eye when she took the last word in a conversation and twisted it just enough. They didn't see the flicker of satisfaction when someone agreed with her. They didn't see the way she studied me when she thought I wasn't looking, as if gauging how much further she could push the story without being caught. It was during one of our rare private moments that I truly understood how far it had gone. She visited one afternoon, unannounced, and stood in my kitchen drinking tea she didn't touch. She complimented the house, the garden, the smell of cinnamon in the air. Her voice was sugar, but her eyes were scanning everything: me, my expression, my hands, the state of my kitchen. And then she said, "You really should consider letting someone help you more often, Nana. It's just a lot for you." It was a test to see how I would respond. If I became defensive, she would use it. If I brushed it off, she'd take it as permission. I simply nodded and said I was doing fine. She smiled and left 15 minutes later. That night, I checked the medicine cabinet and noticed 2 bottles out of place, one cap not fully screwed on, one label slightly peeled. I had no proof, but my instinct screamed. I photographed the cabinet, time-stamped the image, and placed the bottles into a small box in my closet. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but something told me I needed to document everything. Claire had started a fire behind my back, and I had been trying to put it out with bare hands. But not anymore. She had cast a shadow over me. Now I was learning how to gather light. It wasn't until I began writing things down that the full weight of it settled over me. I had kept journals throughout my life, pages filled with quotes, memories, grocery lists, names of books I loved. But now my writing had a different tone. This wasn't nostalgia or habit. It was survival. It was evidence. I took an old spiral-bound notebook from the bottom drawer of my desk, tore out the pages filled with idle reflections, and began again. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Claire, lies and contradictions." I didn't mean to make it sound so clinical, but I needed clarity. I needed structure. I needed something to hold on to while the ground beneath my family relationships kept shifting. The entries started small. Things she said versus things that happened. Dates she claimed to have visited me, cross-referenced with receipts or calendar notes that proved otherwise. Screenshots of texts where she offered to do something kind. Pick up groceries, bring over soup when I had a cold, but never followed through. These small inconsistencies didn't seem damning on their own, but when compiled, they painted a very different picture. They showed a pattern. It was the pattern that mattered. Claire was not careless. She was calculating. She knew exactly how to phrase things so they sounded believable. She rarely made outright accusations. Instead, she planted suggestions. I think Nana's been forgetting things lately. I worry she's lonely and maybe imagining things. She's not always consistent. And because she looked polished, concerned, and calm, no one questioned her. But the contradictions kept piling up. She told my daughter-in-law that I once wandered into a neighbor's backyard and had to be walked home. That never happened. I still walked a mile every morning around the neighborhood loop. I even had a smart watch that logged my steps, which I began screenshotting weekly just in case I needed proof. She told my son I was struggling to keep up with bills, but I had never missed a payment in my life. I kept meticulous records, check stubs, statements, confirmations, so I began scanning them, creating a digital archive. I organized folders by category, by month, by relevance. There were nights I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking, reconstructing conversations in my head, wondering how many others she had spoken to, wondering what version of me existed now in their minds. It wasn't grief I felt. It was erosion, a slow, quiet dissolving of the identity I had built over a lifetime. I started recording phone calls. Pennsylvania is a two-party consent state, so I didn't use those recordings for anything official, but I needed them. I needed to hear my own voice, calm and steady, in contrast to the gentle manipulation that crept through hers. She would call to check in, ask vague questions, subtly steering me into confusion. When I didn't play along, she'd switch tactics, acting hurt or disappointed. It was always a game I hadn't agreed to play. One day, I visited the doctor for a routine checkup and asked to review my records. I wanted to be certain nothing had been added without my knowledge. Nothing had, but I still requested printed copies. I filed them away with the rest, proof that I was mentally competent, physically stable, and in control of my life. I also began speaking to people, quietly, carefully. My neighbors, the women at church, even an old colleague from the library. I asked gentle questions, not about Claire specifically, but about what they'd heard, what they'd seen. Sometimes the answers came indirectly. I heard something, but I didn't think it was true. Or, she said you were having a rough time, but I figured it was just stress. Or, worst of all, I didn't want to bring it up. The silence spoke volumes. I understood something then. Claire wasn't just lying about me. She was isolating me. She was painting me as someone unreliable so that when the truth did surface, no one would believe me. That was the cruelty of it. Not just the fabrication, but the insulation. She was building a wall of doubt between me and the people I loved. But I was no stranger to walls. I had spent a lifetime organizing shelves, cataloging information, preserving knowledge. I knew how to dismantle something one brick at a time. I returned to my journals. I began copying key passages into a clean typed document. Every inconsistency, every contradiction, every lie. I formatted it neatly, numbered the entries, included timestamps and screenshots where applicable. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but having it made me feel sane again, seen, real. I kept the printed version hidden in the back of my linen closet, tucked between old pillowcases and winter blankets. It was my safeguard, my record, my testimony, not a weapon, but a shield. I thought about the old expression, sleeping on a bed of lies. And I wondered how many nights Claire had rested easy, thinking she had buried me under hers. But I had never been buried. I had just been quiet. Now, under my pillow, metaphorically and otherwise, were stones, Not soft lies, but hard truth, and I was no longer afraid to use them. The invitation came in the form of a group text, Claire's name at the top, followed by the string of family members who were always included in these digital gatherings. She was hosting a family dinner, just something casual, at her parents' house. A chance to catch up, she said, and spend time with those who matter most. I read the message twice, then set the phone down without replying. It wasn't the invitation itself that unsettled me. It was the assumption behind it, that I would show up quietly and gratefully, as though nothing had happened, as though I hadn't felt the slow erosion of trust beneath my feet, as though I hadn't spent the past months piecing together the narrative she had sewn around me like a burial shroud. And yet, I knew I would go, not to make a scene, not to confront, but to observe, to feel in person the extent of the role I now played in the family theater. I baked an apple pie that afternoon. It was something I had always done for gatherings, ever since Claire was little. She used to insist on helping with the crust, her small fingers smudging the edges, giggling every time flour got on her nose. I hadn't baked one in a long time. The recipe came easily, though. Muscle memory, scent memory. As the pie cooled on the counter, I felt a strange steadiness settle inside me. That evening, I dressed simply. A soft cardigan, a long skirt, comfortable shoes. Nothing attention-seeking, nothing severe. Just the version of myself they all claimed to know. Warm, neat, quiet. I brought the pie in a cloth-covered basket and walked up to the house I had once helped them paint. The porch light was on. Laughter spilled from the living room window. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with food and noise. My son greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. My daughter-in-law offered to take the pie. Claire waved from across the room with the same bright smile I remembered from her childhood. Only now it felt hollow, like something worn for a performance. She didn't come closer. She didn't need to. The evening unfolded in waves of conversation and clinking silverware. People talked over one another, laughter rising and falling like a tide. I sat near the end of the table, where I had always sat, but this time the placement felt deliberate, out of the main circle, on the periphery. I watched as Claire told stories about work, about her latest trip, about a friend's baby shower. She commanded the room with ease, every gesture choreographed, every word carefully measured. She was charming. She was composed. She was believed. No one asked me anything of substance. They asked about my garden, whether the lilacs had bloomed. They asked if I still volunteered at the library. Small, safe topics. No one brought up the things that mattered. Not the rumors. Not the moments that had slowly unraveled me. And I didn't bring them up either. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see just how far they were willing to let me disappear. At one point, Claire told a story that made the entire table laugh. It was about me. A funny little moment, she said, when I forgot my own address and had to ask a stranger for directions. She told it with a laugh, with a shrug, with a tone of sweet concern. People chuckled politely. My son smiled, though his eyes didn't meet mine. I sat perfectly still. I hadn't forgotten my address. That story had never happened. But no one questioned it. No one turned to me and asked if it was true. They just laughed, then moved on. The moment passed, and with it, another small piece of me was edited out of existence. I realized then that I was no longer part of the narrative. I had become a character, a caricature, the sweet, slightly confused grandmother, harmless, peripheral, a prop in Claire's version of the story, a story where she was the concerned voice of reason, the gentle caretaker of a fading matriarch. She had taken my silence and turned it into consent. But I hadn't consented. I had simply waited. Later, after dessert, while people lingered with half-full coffee cups and crumpled napkins, I stood up and quietly excused myself. No one insisted I stay. No one walked me to the door. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it should have for spring. I pulled my cardigan tighter and walked slowly to my car, listening to the soft gravel crunch beneath my shoes. Back home, I undressed with care and stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I looked at my face, creased, yes, and tired, but not confused, not lost, not gone. I saw a woman who had lived, who had raised children, who had built a life of meaning. I saw a woman who had been written out of her own story, but who still held the pen. I returned to my notebook that night and added more pages. I recorded the story Claire had told at dinner. I logged the expressions on their faces. I noted who laughed, who looked away, who stayed silent. Not out of spite, but out of preparation. Because eventually there would come a time when truth would need to rise, not as vengeance, but as restoration. They had all spoken freely, assuming I would remain voiceless. But silence is not absence, and I had not yet spoken. The morning after the dinner, I awoke with a strange clarity, as if something had finally settled inside me. It wasn't anger, not the sharp, searing kind, but a slow-burning resolve. I stood in the kitchen with my tea and stared out the window at the dogwood tree in the backyard, watching its pale blossoms shift in the breeze. There was a time when Claire used to sit beneath that tree and read aloud from her favorite books. Now her voice lived in my mind as something else entirely, measured, curated, and dangerously convincing. I had spent months watching her words weave a different version of me into the minds of those I loved. I had cataloged every whisper, every contradiction, every dismissive glance. But what I hadn't yet done was shape those pieces into something that could be held, opened, examined, something undeniable. I needed a file, not a notebook, not a hidden stack of handwritten pages in the back of my drawer. I needed something digital, organized, presentable, something that, when the time came, would speak for me in clear, irrefutable language, something that couldn't be laughed off or explained away as senility or sentimentality. I opened my laptop and created a folder named Truth. The word looked too plain at first, too dramatic. I changed it to Notes, then Archive. Eventually, I settled on Family Records. It didn't matter what I called it. What mattered was what went inside. I began with the text messages. I copied screenshots of every exchange between me and Claire over the past 2 years. Messages where she promised to visit and didn't. Messages where she alluded to things I'd supposedly said or done. Vague, floating statements that hinted at instability. "I'm worried about you, Nana. You seemed really confused last week. Are you sure you remember that correctly? I told Mom you might need help organizing your meds." Those words, out of context, could be dismissed. But side by side, they revealed something else, a pattern, a script, a slow, deliberate campaign to reframe me. I didn't stop with texts. I dug into my calendar, comparing her statements with actual dates. She told my son she had visited me the weekend of his birthday. My calendar showed I had spent that weekend at a church retreat 3 towns over. I still had the receipts from the hotel. I scanned them and added them to the file. Phone call logs, doctor's notes, prescription summaries, banking records. I gathered anything that could quietly refute the image she had been building of me. Forgetful, fragile, unstable. I saved everything as PDFs and labeled them by date and subject. Next came the photos. not just of Claire and me, but of family events. I zoomed in on her expressions, the subtle moments she thought no one was watching. In some, she stood just a little apart from the others. In others, she leaned in close to someone's ear, whispering. I wasn't building a case on body language alone, but every detail helped. I included captions where relevant. Thanksgiving 2021. Claire left abruptly after saying she felt uncomfortable around me. I had not spoken to her directly that evening. Then came the real work, the emails. Claire didn't write often, but when she did, her tone shifted from warmth to veiled correction. One message, sent to my son and CC'd to me, had the subject line, "Concerned about Nana." She listed reasons why she thought I might be declining: missed calls, odd behavior, a voicemail she claimed didn't make sense. I played that voicemail over and over again. I had simply forgotten to hang up and left a message with the faint sound of bird song and my grocery list in the background. That was her evidence. That was the beginning of her argument. I saved the email and added a note in red beneath it. Sent 2 days after I declined her request for money to help with a down payment. That note led me to another piece, the financial trail. I pulled up my bank records and found the date she had made the request. It was subtle, cloaked in care. If it's too much, I completely understand. I just thought I'd ask. I had said no, politely, firmly. She never mentioned it again. Until the emails started, until the stories spread. I documented all of it. My fingers moved faster as the hours passed. It was like assembling a puzzle whose pieces I hadn't realized I'd been collecting. The lies weren't big. They weren't explosive. But they were persistent, and they added up. By the end of the day, I had nearly 50 pages of records, dates, screenshots, transcripts, scanned documents, and annotations. I formatted the file like a report, neatly, clearly, chronologically. No emotion, just fact. I emailed a copy to myself, saved another to a USB drive, and printed one master hard copy, which I slid into a slim blue folder. I placed that folder in a drawer next to my birth certificate and will. And then I wrote a short note and paper-clipped it to the front page. It read, "If I am ever unable to speak for myself, let this speak in my place." There was no satisfaction in finishing the file, no rush of victory, only a quiet, clean readiness. The kind that comes when you finally put your name back where it belongs, on your own story. Claire had spent so long crafting a version of me that served her purpose. She had counted on my silence, on my dignity, on the fact that I would never fight back. She was right about one thing. I wouldn't fight, but I would tell the truth, and the truth doesn't yell. It waits. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I decided the time had come. There was no particular trigger, no outburst, no revelation, just a steady feeling that had been rising inside me for weeks and now rested in my chest like calm, anchored certainty. I had waited long enough. I had prepared long enough. And sometimes truth doesn't need a perfect moment. Sometimes it simply needs a chair at the table. I called my son and invited the family for dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just a small gathering at my house, like old times. I offered no reason, no occasion. "It's been a while," I said. "I'd like to cook." He sounded surprised, but he agreed. One by one, the confirmations trickled in. My daughter-in-law offered to bring wine. My nephew would bring a salad. Claire would be coming too. That afternoon, I cooked slowly. I chose familiar dishes, the ones that carried memory in every bite: roast chicken, garlic potatoes, green beans with slivered almonds, cornbread. I didn't bake a pie. That felt too sentimental, and I didn't want nostalgia to soften the edges of what needed to be said. I wanted this evening to feel normal, unremarkable. Like any other dinner, that was the point. I set the table with my mother's porcelain, polished the old silverware, and folded the cloth napkins with precision. Every corner of the house felt quietly alert. I moved through the rooms with practiced grace, pausing now and then to glance at the blue folder on the sideboard, resting between two candlesticks. It waited like I did, patient and still. Guests arrived in waves. Coats were draped over the arm of the couch. Laughter echoed from the foyer to the kitchen, and the smell of warm food filled the house like it used to. Claire arrived last, wearing a soft beige sweater, her hair tied back, her tone casual and affectionate. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a compliment on the smell of the roast. Her voice was smooth, effortless, polished. I wondered if she knew what was coming. I don't think she did. Dinner began like every other family meal, noisy, overlapping conversations, hands passing dishes, moments of laughter. I smiled where appropriate, nodded, engaged in light conversation. No one seemed to suspect that anything was different. No one asked why I had called them together. Maybe they thought I was simply feeling nostalgic. Maybe they thought I was lonely. The truth sat beside me, silent and steady. I waited until the plates had been cleared, until dessert had been offered and declined. People were still seated, still leaning into one another with the relaxed ease of full bellies and shared history. The hum of conversation began to dip, the rhythm slowing into that soft, satisfied quiet that comes after a meal well enjoyed. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for silence. I simply picked up the blue folder and brought it to the table. The shift in the room was instant and subtle. Eyes turned, postures straightened. A few exchanged glances. Claire kept her expression neutral, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the shift, the calculation. I told them I wanted to share something. Just a few pages, just some things I had noticed over the past year or two. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I read, clearly, calmly, page by page. The air changed, slowly at first. My words were not emotional. They were facts. Side-by-side statements, dates, contradictions, examples of moments where things had been said that were not true. Times when I had been framed as confused, forgetful, unstable, when I had not been. I read from screenshots of text messages. I shared the content of emails. I laid out discrepancies between what had been claimed and what had actually happened. I spoke as someone who had been silent too long and had chosen now to reclaim space. I spoke without tears, without shaking. I was not the character Claire had drawn in the background of her story. I was no one's footnote. I had done the work. I had receipts. Some people looked stunned. Others looked embarrassed. No one said anything at first, not even Claire. She shifted in her seat, folded and unfolded her napkin, then crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. She began to open her mouth once or twice, but stopped herself. For once, she had no script ready. I finished reading and closed the folder. I didn't look around for validation. I didn't wait for applause or apologies. I simply said, "That's all." Silence held the room. After a moment, my son cleared his throat. He looked uncertain. My daughter-in-law stared down at her lap. One of the younger cousins looked wide-eyed and confused. Claire's expression was blank, drained of performance. I rose from the table and carried the folder back to the sideboard. Conversation resumed eventually, though in a slower, more fragmented way. Some tried to pretend nothing had happened. Others asked quiet questions in the kitchen, in the hallway, after coats were gathered and shoes were slipped on. I answered gently when I chose to. I didn't elaborate beyond what was already shared. The truth had been laid bare. What they did with it was theirs to carry. That night, when the house was empty and the last of the dishes had been washed and dried, I stood by the window and watched the dark press against the glass. The silence that filled the house now wasn't lonely. It wasn't heavy. It was clean. It was earned. They had expected the evening to unfold like any other, a normal Sunday dinner. But some truths arrive without thunder, without spectacle. Sometimes they just pull up a chair and stay. The days after the dinner passed like a soft tremor beneath the surface. No one said anything directly. No one called to discuss what had been read. There were no apologies, no accusations. But everything was different. I could feel it in the space between messages, in the way people paused before speaking to me, in the absence of Claire's usual breezy texts that once fluttered in like leaves from a tree I no longer trusted. I didn't seek confrontation. I had no interest in forcing remorse from anyone. I hadn't spoken for that reason. I had spoken because I needed to, because something had been torn away from me, and I had decided to stitch it back, not to shame, but to restore. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of recognition. A new weight hung in the air around my family. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was something heavier than that. Awareness, maybe. Or the slow dawning realization that I had been watching while they hadn't been looking at all. My son came by a few days later. He didn't mention the dinner. He talked about the car needing a new battery, about a friend from work moving out of state. His voice was steady but cautious, like someone stepping over cracked ice. He helped me bring in groceries and lingered longer than usual, sipping tea without the usual rush. He didn't say what I thought he might, but he stayed, and that mattered. I could feel the shift. Not dramatic, not performative, but real. The way he looked at me was different. He watched me now, not with suspicion or with that carefully trained sympathy Claire had taught him, but with attention, with curiosity, like he had found a chapter in a book he thought he knew and realized it had been missing all along. Claire didn't come around, not that week, not the next. She didn't send a message or offer an explanation. She disappeared with the same elegance she had always wrapped herself in. But this time, it didn't feel like power. It felt like retreat, like the quiet that follows a door closing a little too softly to be sincere. Others began reaching out. My niece called and asked if I had any old family recipes I could share. My cousin sent a card with a quote scribbled on the back about strength and aging. Small gestures, but none of them mentioned Claire. No one wanted to say her name out loud. Perhaps they feared that to speak it would make everything real again. Perhaps they still didn't know how to sit with what had been shown to them. I didn't press. Truth has its own rhythm. It doesn't demand. It lingers. I found myself enjoying things I hadn't in months. I returned to my book club. I started walking every morning again, just before the sun crested over the tops of the trees. I planted new herbs by the kitchen window and rearranged the photos on the mantel, not to erase anything, but to remind myself that I was still here, still rooted, still holding the pieces together, and the silence held too. It wasn't punishing anymore. It wasn't cruel. It was reverent. There's a kind of quiet that feels like exile, but there's another kind that feels like peace. This was the second kind. I had learned that sometimes speaking is not about the noise it creates. It's about the noise it stills, the lies that fall quiet, the assumptions that stop echoing, the doubt that collapses under its own weight. One evening, I sat out on the porch with a cup of tea and watched a thunderstorm roll in from the west. The sky darkened slowly, deliberately, as if asking permission. And then the rain came, steady, cleansing, unapologetic. I listened to it hit the roof, the railing, the leaves. The wind tugged at the edges of my sweater, and I pulled it tighter around my shoulders. That was when I realized I hadn't thought about Claire all day. Not with bitterness, not with longing. Just not at all. And that, I think, was the loudest moment of all. In the weeks that followed, my home returned to something that felt like mine again. Not because the past was erased, or because everything had gone back to how it once was, but because I had taken back the right to name my own story. That alone changed the air inside my walls. I could feel it in the way I moved through the rooms, slower and steadier. I no longer tiptoed around the edges of my life, second-guessing my memory or my worth. I walked straight through the center of it. Claire remained absent. Her silence was not a surprise, but the shape of it was sharper than I'd anticipated. There was no apology, no awkward note or deflection, no performance of remorse. She vanished as cleanly as she had appeared, as if my refusal to be rewritten had removed the stage beneath her feet. I didn't chase after closure. I had no interest in a confrontation scripted for her comfort. She had spoken enough. Now, silence would speak for me. I didn't share the folder again. I didn't send it out to the family or email it to those who hadn't been at dinner. It wasn't about spectacle. It never had been. The file remained where it was, tucked away in the drawer beside my will, my birth certificate, the documents that said, I lived, I was here, I mattered. Let that be enough. People began to see me differently, not dramatically, but in small, telling ways. They stopped over-explaining things. They stopped offering unsolicited help with my finances or medications I didn't take. My son invited me to his house for Sunday lunch without prompting. My niece called to ask about a childhood memory, not to check on me, but to share something real. These were not repairs. These were recognitions, quiet, cautious, human. I didn't demand they believe me. I simply let them see me. Sometimes that's all truth needs. I spent more time with myself, but not in loneliness. I went back to painting in the mornings, something I hadn't done in years. Not well, but earnestly. I planted wildflowers near the edge of the yard and watched them come up through the dry soil with more fight than I expected. I read books I'd long meant to and cooked meals just for me, not waiting for a visit or an occasion. There were nights when I sat on the porch with a blanket around my legs, the sky shifting slowly from dusk to dark, and I thought about everything that had happened, not with anger, but with clarity. What Claire had done wasn't just about me. It was about control, about power dressed up as concern. And for a while, she had succeeded. She had convinced people to doubt me using the gentlest tools: concern, subtlety, carefully chosen words. But truth has a pulse. It survives the quiet, the erasure, the absence. It doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it walks into a room, sits down, and says nothing, because it doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just needs to stand still long enough for people to notice what's always been there. I let go of the need for them all to understand. Some never would, not fully. Some might still hold on to versions of events that comforted them more than truth ever could. But that was their burden, not mine. I had stopped carrying the weight of other people's comfort a long time ago. Truth is not a weapon. It is not a performance. It is not a clever retort or a triumphant speech. It is the soft, steady refusal to disappear. And in the end, that was enough. I didn't get back what was lost. Time, trust, ease. Those things don't return in their original form. But I gained something else. I gained the sound of my own voice again. Not loud, not shaking, but whole. And that voice told me something I now believed with all my heart. You do not have to raise your voice to reclaim your place. You only have to stop letting others speak over you. Truth, I had learned, doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be spoken, once, clearly, and then left on the table for everyone to see.